I just want to make sure I got it right. It's George Ewer, correct, George?
Absolutely, Ian. Good to hear you again.
And you too. And you are featured in the After Dark newsletter too, with the WebBot discussion. We'll get into that in just a second. Tell us what your specialty is as a business consultant, George.
Well, it's really two things that I practice. One is sales and marketing, and the other is strategic planning. And in that regard, the strategic planning arena has really been the area of a lot of focus, at least among my clients this year. We've been able to accurately get a grip on the unrolling of this recession verging on depression, so that these companies have been able to properly position themselves both in terms of resource and number of employees and CapEx, capital expenditures, to hopefully be able to make it through less damaged than folks that don't pay as much attention to strategic planning.
There's some pretty dire predictions by even just mainstream Wall Street observers saying somewhere in the area of 200 chain stores might fail in 2009, and as many as 75,000 or so more people will end up losing their small businesses. And so not just the big ones, but 73 to 75,000 small businesses are going to go out of business too. Where are you with that?
I think that's probably on the low side. Unfortunately, what we're likely seeing is summarized as the year of transformation. And what that means, Ian, is essentially we're in crack-up mode for the consumer-driven economy. When we start cutting down parts of the rainforest to put trivial products on American shopping shelves, you know the end is near. It's almost like bacteria eating their way from the center of a culture dish out toward the edge. At some point, they hit the edge of the petri dish, and there's no more nutrition available, and then the bacteria start to die off. Unfortunately, at a global level, we're quickly approaching that kind of watershed event.
Okay. So what do you see specifically then for 2009?
Well, specifically, we call it the year of transformation because we're going to be seeing almost everyone in the country, in fact, globally, will probably find that their life is dramatically different in fundamental ways come the end of the year. We'll have something of a fuzzy revolution as the relationship of the social contract and the people of the world goes through a metamorphosis. The constant, in fact, Gerald Celente mentioned that earlier in your show,
right?
When he said that we're just up against the wall here, words to that effect. And unfortunately, the Igor Panarin forecast. He's the Russian economist,
right, from the Wall Street Journal we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. He has a very interesting vision of the U.S. breaking up into 6 regions. With the West Coast sort of beholden to China, the South being beholden to Mexico, the Northeast going to Europeans' influence, and maybe the Upper Midwest becoming part of a greater Canada. But we don't really see it that way because what Panarin's analysis really failed to take into account, I think, is that when the U.S. hits the wall, we ain't going to be going to the wall by ourselves. In other words, China, for example, just to look at the West Coast, already we're seeing this year that West Coast container traffic is down about 15%. It'll likely collapse to maybe half of that amount in 2009 because the U.S. discretionary consumer dollars are quickly disappearing. And as they disappear, the demand for Chinese-made goods will collapse, and that leaves China, which doesn't have a big enough middle class just yet, to tell us to kiss off. They're going to be hit with internal domestic problems too. And so this whole thing begins to cascade. That's one of the reasons that in the great game of financial musical chairs that's been ongoing with regard to paper assets, nobody has been willing to stop the music and say, okay, everybody find a chair. It's in all major government interests globally to keep this thing going as long as they can, because when it hits the wall, we're going to see something much worse than the Great Depression.
When do you think that will happen?
It's happening. Last year when I was on your show, I don't know if you remember, but we forecast that in October of 2008 there would be a global emotional release event beginning. It would be largely economic. It would replay in some technical ways the impact of the 1932 bond crash in the Great Depression. And we're in the middle of that right now. Even though it seems to have slowed over the holidays, we expect it will resume shortly over the next few weeks, and we won't really hit a meaningful bottom until maybe February 14, March 1st, that kind of range. And then we flip into hyperinflation.
Right. Talk about I want to get, there's lots of interesting questions about the hyperinflation, and I'll get to that, but tell me a little bit about your methodology.
The methodology is really interesting. A friend of mine, Cliff, I'll call him, because that's his name, runs a website called halfpasthuman.com. And he wrote to me back in 2001 saying that as a SQL database programmer, he had developed a way to send spiders and robots out to mechanically read literally hundreds of thousands of websites that are discussion forums. And by taking snapshots of key linguistics and running those through lots of analysis, you can distill a future view of events, because it's pretty well acknowledged that at some level humans are psychic. Now, it may or may not be immediately reproducible in a laboratory, but Dean Radin's work, of course, says, yes, people emotionally react to events before they actually take place by some number of seconds,
right,
on a measurable and repeatable basis.
Sure.
And,
right.
and what happens on the Internet is people go through a very subtle change of language, months, even years before events. And an example of something that is a years in advance is something called Death of the Dollar that we've been tracking since about 2003, 2004. And it seems to be that the bigger the emotional event and the more people are impacted, the more lead time we get on it. So something where 300,000 people are displaced and die because of the earthquake in Banda Aceh back in 2004, we got about 6 months of heads up on that. We got a similar kind of lead time on Katrina Rita. And on May 9th of this year, on the Urban Survival site, we put up a public warning about the earthquake, the so-called wedding quake. And then on May 21st, 22nd, those pictures of the people in China standing outside the collapsed church, right, went global. And we get things wrong. I mean, I was on with George Norrie a couple of days before December 10, and we had been anticipating that December 10 to 12, someplace in that range, we'd see